Hello everybody and welcome to this video kindly sponsored by Squarespace. You've probably heard of them before. Their services allow you to build websites, online stores, marketing tools, all sorts of wonderful things that you can do on a web browser. But Drac, I hear you ask, why are you talking to us about this? You said your sponsorships would be related to naval history. Well, this one is because I use Squarespace to manage the website I built, drakenefeld.co.uk. And the tools available have allowed me to put up articles submitted by guest authors, information about the upcoming trip to America, a digital contact form, and of course the photo archive, which is gradually growing, which will soon not only include many more photos, but also PDFs of publications from the time period as well. And the easy-to-use configuration page allows me to set up such things as member areas, if I get the time to do that, as well as being easily able to add a web store page. So, for example, if the 3.5-foot stack of duplicate naval books that I happen to have needs to be moved on at some point. All in all, it's a wonderful platform that lets me share a lot of fixed information with you wonderful subscribers without having to repeat myself every other week. So if you've ever wanted to have your own website but been a bit put off by the complexities that seem to be inherent in designing one, well, head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you want to push that website out to the big wide world, go to squarespace.com/Drakenefeld to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. So thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. In a somewhat fitting twist, all the revenue generated from the sponsorship will be going into purchasing more naval photographs, which are hosted on the website, or indeed on paying for some of the expenses of the America trip. Schedule also hosted on the website. So, on with the video. Half a millennia ago, at a point closer to the Norman invasion of England than it is to the present day, there was a fairly calm section of the River Medway, and not a lot was happening. But many miles away in the royal palaces and on the south coast of England, the new king, Henry VIII, was beginning to take the handful of ships that he'd inherited from his father, Henry VII, and turn them in to the organisation that we would now recognise as the Royal Navy. Whilst the anchorages at Portsmouth and a few other smaller places up and down the English coast were more than adequate to hold this initial tranche of Royal Navy vessels, the fleet that Henry VIII planned, and indeed built, would grow such that fitting them all in was a little bit tight. And also, Henry VIII, in the manner of all good bellicose English kings, made more than one enemy. There was, of course, France, that was traditional, almost a given, but there were a few other nations out there who began to take a little bit of umbrage at Henry VIII's more externally minded expansion plans. The Thames itself was chock full of merchant traffic, but just south of the Thames estuary, on the River Medway, there was a bit more space, pretty swift access to the North Sea, and good overland communications and transport links. And thus, royal ships began to moor in this location as well as in Portsmouth. At first, this was kind of an informal arrangement. A few local buildings were hired, but it wasn't an official base until in 1550 a decree was given that all the king's ships should be harboured in Gillingham water, save only those that be at Portsmouth. As an anchorage, it also meant that ships that were in need of significant repair could head out and then up the Thames to Deptford and Woolwich, two royal dockyards based on that river. By this point, the king was Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, and after a brief chaotic hiatus involving Lady Jane Grey and Mary I, the monarchy settled back with Elizabeth I in charge a few years later. It would be during her reign, in 1567, that the anchorage was changed to a Royal Naval Dockyard. Now ships would be able to be repaired on site rather than having to head up to Deptford or Woolwich, or possibly down the coast to Portsmouth, depending on capacity. As the dockyard took shape and grew in importance, it began to be increasingly referred to as Chatham Dockyard rather than Gillingham, this area of the Medway having three separate settlements on its southern banks: Rochester, just further upriver, Gillingham, just further downriver, and the small village of Chatham, which geographically just about was the closest to the dockyard. By the end of the 1500s, the dockyard could boast its very own dry dock, a crane, which was quite useful for lifting heavy loads, various saw pits, workshops and storehouses, which were useful for turning bulk timber into useful planking and other for such things, as well as a mast pond, which was very useful, this being a small enclosed body of water in which mast timbers could be stored long term to keep them from drying out and cracking or warping, as well as a forge where you could make anything from small ironwork all the way up to anchors. As time progressed and the 16th century became the 17th century, an expanding Royal Navy needed a larger facility to refit and repair its warships. Heading well up the Thames was becoming a bit of a problem, and again, traffic on the Thames was somewhat constricting. Chatham seemed to be the logical choice and was nominated for significant expansion. However, the original dockyard site was a fraction too small, and so the entire complex began to grow northwards on this particular bend on the Medway. Much of the old dockyard area was handed over to the Board of Ordnance, who usefully decided to use it as an ordnance depot and gun wharf, which meant that the ships being built, refitted and repaired at Chatham had ready nearby access to a facility where they could offload their guns prior to going into dry dock and take on board new guns if their old ones were worn out or broken, as well as take on ammunition and other such warlike supplies without having to go all that great a distance. The facilities present at the original dry dock were duplicated and expanded upon, with multiple mast ponds, multiple dry docks, and new warehouses constructed. A slipway was added which allowed Chatham to build its own ships as well as repair and refit pre-existing ones, and new facilities were added, everything from accommodation and administration blocks to a sail loft, a place to manufacture, repair and store the vast amounts of canvas needed to make sails, and a ropery, a very, very long building in which the ropes needed for the rigging and for anchors and all other such uses on an age of sail warship could be inspected and, more importantly, manufactured. It can't be overstated just how critically important roperies were for ships of this period. Any kind of knot or join is a weak point in a rope, and at sea, the stresses and strains that a rope will be put under, especially on an age of sail warship, were considerable. So it was better to have ropes as a single long length. But in order to make a rope of a single long length without having it twist and turn all over the place, you needed a very long building, and thus purely out of necessity, naval roperies very rapidly became the single longest open rooms in any kind of man-made structure for a very, very long time to come. It wasn't all sunshine and roses. The Dutch fleet showed up in the Second Anglo-Dutch War for the famous raid on the Medway, and came very close to totalling Chatham as an operational dockyard. Fortunately, however, the dockyard survived pretty much intact. As a fleet base, however, Chatham was rapidly approaching its heyday, which would pretty much be the late 17th century. As the 18th century progressed, France became more and more the dominant enemy, which of course meant that ports on the southern coast, closer to France and closer out to the western approaches, where raiding, protection against raiding and blockade of the French Atlantic coast could be done, became more and more important. Chatham, which had access to the North Sea, therefore became somewhat less important, and those southern coast ports began to grow in terms of their dockyard facilities. Additionally, the Medway began to silt up, which limited the available space for anchorage. Still, with 6 building slips, multiple dry docks, and a vast array of infrastructure and machinery, such as machinery could be before the Industrial Revolution, Chatham was still a very important dockyard, but it began to shift more towards a place to build ships, and occasionally refit them, and store vessels in ordinary on the Medway, as opposed to a primary fleet base. As said, that emphasis had shifted more to the south coast. Notably, during this period, she would build the Royal Navy's most famous vessel. HMS Victory left Chatham Dockyard in the latter part of the 18th century, more specifically launched in 1765. And indeed, after a brief operational career, Victory would spend a significant portion of her time near the place of her birth, lying up in ordinary, before going on to win fame and glory in the Napoleonic Wars. The coming of the Industrial Revolution allowed both wooden warships in the first half of the 19th century and then later iron warships to be built on a scale that was much, much greater than wooden ships of the line had been in the 17th and 18th centuries. This meant that slipways and dry docks needed to be expanded, new steam-powered machinery was installed, and a number of buildings were reconfigured. Chatham would continue to lead the way as a shipyard, building early Royal Navy steamships, refitting other Royal Navy ships previously equipped only with sail with new steam engines, and constructing one of the first Royal Navy armoured vessels, the Armoured Floating Battery Etna, which was used in the Crimean War. Whilst the contracts for the Royal Navy's first ironclad warships, Warrior and Black Prince, would go to private yards, very shortly thereafter the contract would come to Chatham to build HMS Achilles, the first ironclad warship to be constructed in a royal dockyard. This time period would also see Chatham acquire its own railway network. This allowed the easier transport of bulk items such as food and rope, as well as the relocation of much heavier single items such as iron armour plate and guns from wharves, quays and storehouses over to the slipways and dry docks where ships were being assembled or refitted. But quite a number of royal dockyards were facing difficulties by the latter part of the 19th century. Most of them had been established around about the time that Chatham itself had, or shortly thereafter, back when ships displaced a few hundred to maybe just over 1,000 tons and were made of wood. Nowadays, ships would displace multiple thousands of tons, some even displaced over 10,000 tons, and were made of iron and increasingly steel. Also, unlike the old age of sail ships, where fitting out the ship consisted mainly of craning in the cannon and dropping the masts into their slots, at least as far as the large-scale stuff went. Whereas nowadays there were propellers and engines and all sorts of things that went deep in the ship, which were somewhat harder to fit if the ship was just moored out on the Medway. Some royal dockyards simply couldn't be expanded. Woolwich Dockyard closed at the end of the 1860s, but some of its equipment, materials and, believe it or not, buildings were relocated to Chatham, which it was felt could stand to be a little bit further upgraded. And so it was. New machinery was added, new dry docks were built, existing slipways and dry docks were upgraded, new facilities were constructed in addition to the ones that had been brought over from Woolwich, and Chatham happily went on producing ships, up to and including a number of pre-dreadnought battleships. But this brought us to the start of the 20th century, and whilst the administrators of the Chatham Dockyard felt that it could be expanded still further, and new slipways and dry docks created to accommodate the new dreadnought style of battleship, it was felt by the Admiralty that perhaps this wasn't such a good idea, and new dockyards would be opened, particularly at Rosyth. And so, for the first time in about 350 years, Chatham found itself unable to keep pace with the latest and greatest in Royal Navy warships. But, thanks to its age and size, it had a lot of smaller slipways and dry docks, and so it was decided that Chatham would continue to build ships for the Navy, just not the capital ships. Instead, it took up the construction of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. In the interwar period, this would include the Royal Navy's brief foray into the submarine cruiser design, HMS X-1. But even these smaller ships were beginning to grow. In World War I, a light cruiser might be 4, 5 or 6,000 tons, but by the 1930s a town-class light cruiser was 10,000 tons and very nearly the same length as Dreadnought. And so as the 20th century progressed, so did the fortunes of Chatham Dockyard begin to fade. By World War II, it was basically building only submarines. In the 1950s, a number of ancillary and associated commands and facilities were shut down, and in the 1960s the last warships the dockyard would ever build, Oberon-class submarines, were completed and sent to their new homes in the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy. The 1970s passed with the once mighty dockyard only being used to refit and refuel nuclear submarines, and by the early 1980s it was planned to close the dockyard completely. As an active Royal Navy base, Chatham would have one last hour of glory. In 1982, with the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands, the dockyard would be used first to repurpose ships preparing for their voyage to the South Atlantic, and once the war was concluded, repairing a number of ships that had come back with damage. But nonetheless, in March 1984, the dockyard shut its gates for the final time, concluding just over 400 years of continuous official occupation by the Royal Navy. Over the following decades, the dockyard site was split up, some parts of it becoming a commercial dockyard, other parts becoming residential areas, still other parts becoming a university, another section became an entertainment and retail complex, and still another part became a small marina, which began the usual accretion of small sailing craft. But a core area, representing about 20% of the overall dockyard area at the time of closure, was preserved and became the Chatham Historic Dockyard. 3 of Chatham's children, HMS Victory, the frigate HMS Unicorn, and the submarine HMS Ocelot, all survive in various parts of the UK. Victory is, of course, based in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard down on the south coast. Unicorn is almost as far as you can get from Victory, based up in Dundee in Scotland, and Ocelot has managed to find its way home to Chatham itself. The Historic Dockyard preserves a significant number of the key buildings and facilities of the old Royal Dockyard, which can now be seen by visitors today. This includes 3 of the dry docks that were used. Number 2 dry dock, which currently houses HMS Cavalier, a C-class destroyer of World War II vintage, is built on the site of the old dock where HMS Victory was constructed. So there is still a dock at the position where Victory was built, it's just not the exact same dock where Victory was built. But why just keep telling you when I can show you? During the pandemic, obviously, as a public attraction, the dockyard had to close, but as restrictions eased, they were kind enough to allow me access, so I got to experience much of Chatham Historic Dockyard pretty much to myself. I must also mention at this point that the visit was also coordinated by the rather wonderful Laurie of the channel Laurie's Mechanical Marvels. Go have a look if you like steam trains or modern vehicles of most descriptions. He has a lot of information to impart, and he does also help out in the dockyard with the railway, which also still exists, not in its full extent, but it is still there. You can see there the tracks running past the 3 existing dry docks. Link to his channel in the video description below. But as you can see from this drone footage, piloted of course by myself, you have Cavalier, Ocelot, and HMS Ganette, a late Victorian composite sloop. Not everything built for the late Victorian Royal Navy was an ironclad after all. Both Ganette and Cavalier sit in dry docks that are still flooded, so they are afloat. Ocelot, meanwhile, sits in an empty dry dock, and you can see here some of the extent of the facilities that are still available for visitation. It's roughly bounded by those trees there off to the left. This is the main museum hall area, and of course part of the car parking facilities, so don't worry about that. The rather empty car park over there, because obviously not many people were there during the restricted period, and the covered slipways which conceal many more marvellous things, including the railway stock of both diesel and steam locomotives. You can, of course, go aboard all 3 vessels. Cavalier, somewhat unsurprisingly, is the most complex, with multiple decks, multiple routes, multiple areas to explore, and of course, having been an in-service Royal Navy destroyer well into the Cold War period, she also boasts some missile launchers on the back, which looks somewhat out of place on an otherwise World War II destroyer, but is still a valuable thing to look at. Ganette, of course, being a composite sloop, is a relatively simple vessel, but nonetheless there are plenty of interesting things to look at, especially how she combines iron and wooden technology. And Ocelot, of course, is a more directly fore-to-aft tour, considering that she is, after all, a submarine. But coming down in stages, some of the eagle-eyed amongst you might be able to spot what looks like a miniature Soviet submarine resting at the end of the space between Ocelot and Ganette over there in the corner. That's actually a film model, which is also quite interesting to have a look at, and you can see on the space between Ocelot and Cavalier a number of dismounted guns and other equipment that you can also go and have a closer look at, that perhaps you might not be able to get quite such a close look at on Cavalier herself. And here, the covered slipways. Apologies for my slightly jerky camera work, I was still getting used to how the drone operated in high winds, but you can see there's quite a wide variety of things stored in there. Everything from old cannon to steam trains to lifeboats, and plenty more besides. In fact, there is also a Polaris missile in there, believe it or not. Not to mention a midget submarine, several pieces of naval artillery, enough ex-army vehicles to constitute their own small museum, and some fairly impressive bits of heavy machinery taken from old ships. In fact, in the spirit of showing not telling, here's the contents of just one of the covered slipways. Now, each of these large sheds used to be a slipway or dry dock that has since been infilled. Not, I hasten to add, by the museum, but this was done much earlier, back in the era when it was still a Royal Navy dockyard. And of course, as I mentioned before, the railway isn't just there for display purposes only. There are in fact working engines present. This is Overlord. I managed to take a ride up and down the railway aboard Overlord, footage to come in a subsequent video, but here I think he is quite happily sitting ready to go. But if for some reason you think that diesel engines are far too advanced and you prefer the old school technology, well, here's Ajax, a 020 tank engine that's quite happily steaming up on the day that I was there, shunting around all the rolling stock and having quite the whale of a time doing so as well. So plenty of active rolling stock for the train enthusiast in your life if you need to persuade one of them to come while you go and look at the ships. And of course, what ships there are. Here's Cavalier, mentioned earlier. She's a C-class destroyer. The C-class, incidentally, the first move back towards fleet destroyers in the Royal Navy building program during World War II. Most of the previous lettered classes from the O's onwards were wartime emergency flotillas with 4.7-inch guns. The C-class reflects a lot of the understandings and learnings from those classes. So she has, for example, 4.5-inch high-angle guns, which were much, much better in the anti-aircraft role than the old 4.7-inch. And she saw some active service during the Second World War, but as you might guess from the lattice radar mast and the Seacat missile launcher there on the back, she served with the Royal Navy well into the Cold War before eventually being decommissioned and then fetching her way back up into Chatham. I also do have the logbook records of one of her voyages, which at some point will be published. But she's a highly fascinating ship, especially for me, as you might imagine, when I found that she had her full intact suite of surface and anti-aircraft fire control computer systems still in there, and whilst not necessarily entirely accessible, at least visible and touchable. HMS Ocelot, being a submarine of the 1960s and serving through to the early 1990s, is a bit beyond the scope of this channel, but still definitely worth a visit. The Oberon class, of which she's a part, were the second to last diesel-electric submarines ever built for the Royal Navy. And interestingly, she went almost near enough straight from the Royal Navy into the hands of the historic dockyard. So she's very well maintained, very well kept, and a very interesting vessel to visit, because unlike a lot of museum ships, she didn't spend any significant time being neglected or used as a refueling ship or an oil platform or a part of a concrete quay or various other horrible indignities that warships have suffered before being rescued. And as you can see, she's also completely out of the water in the dry dock, so you get a nice view of the full lines of a mid-Cold War era submarine. And for those of you who might be wondering, yes, the bulbous protrusion on the bow is in fact her sonar, because you can see more shades of the World War II era of submarine design in her than perhaps you see in modern submarines, which are designed exclusively pretty much for underwater performance. So Ocelot representing, at least in hull form, a kind of transitional stage in that respect. You can also visit HMS Alliance, a slightly older predecessor of her, down in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. And then, of course, we have Ganette. As mentioned before, she's a composite sloop, and not to be underestimated, she actually had quite an interesting career. Serving in the 1870s and onwards, she did pretty much everything you might expect of what you could loosely describe as an ocean-going Victorian gunboat. She kept an eye on various South American countries during the war in the Pacific, before heading over to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, where she took part in some rather aggressive gunboat diplomacy during the Sudan expeditions and campaigns. She also took part in anti-slavery patrols, oceanographic surveying, and once she was decommissioned, she also served as an accommodation hulk for a training school. But during her decommission period. She also, interestingly enough, was the third HMS President. The first one, of course, being the captured American frigate, the second being the frigate that was built to the exact specifications of the captured American frigate once that was found to be rotted out, and then it was Gannett's turn to be HMS President until just before the First World War, when you had another ship taking up the title, and that's when she went off to be the training school accommodation ship. But from that point, she was turned back over to the Royal Navy, which put her in the hands of the Maritime Trust, which began some restoration work, and then in the 1990s she found her home in Chatham Historic Dockyard, where conservation and refitting work is still ongoing. Now, close looks at Ganette and Cavalier will be coming in due course, and there are many other aspects of the Historic Dockyard to visit, because of course I'm not giving you a full tour, because then why would you go there? No, seriously, it is really worth a visit. Now, this part, however, I will take you on a brief tour of. This is the Ropery. This hall is a quarter of a mile long, and believe me, you know about it after you've walked up and down it a few times. It does offer many things, including the somewhat disturbing perspective of a building so long that you look to the other end and you can't actually focus on the opposite wall. But nonetheless, this helpful little drone of mine was able to navigate its way down the length of the ropery. You can see here on the left and the right the various machines that are used to help create the ropes, which in and of itself is an incredibly interesting process. There's a whole display explaining it as well, and you can purchase rope made in the museum to cap it all off, which is quite helpful. And as you can see, the ropes are actually start off life at the other end, the direction we're going, as spools of individual, I guess you'd almost call it twine or string. But with the help of the machines which run on the rope walk on the right, although this rope walk on the left can also be pressed into service if need be, they get turned into some mighty fine bits of rope. You can see some of them lying on the ground there. And of course, as some of you know, I do medieval reenactment, and some of my tent ropes, in fact pretty much all of them now, are held up by rope that I purchased from the Chatham Dockyard Ropery, because you can get machine-made rope, that's absolutely fine, I guess, but rope made by this old-school method, believe it or not, it's actually pretty much superior to most other rope you're going to be able to purchase on the open civilian market, because they still make rope to the same specifications as needed for ships' rigging and ships' anchor cables, because that's what a lot of the rope they sell is actually used for. You can see as we've gone past overhead some of the cylinders and discs. These are remnants of the old power system, both water and steam power, where rotational energy was supplied to distinct axles, upon which were fixed these various cams and wheels, and then leather or later rubber belts could be affixed, which would then provide rotational energy to various machines and mechanisms. One of the small disadvantages of being inside a ropery like this is that, of course, it cuts off all the GPS signals, so the poor old drone sometimes can't figure out where it is, and you have to reset it. But in this case, I thought I'd take a quick pan round. Hello! Just to show you what the interior is like all the way around. And I am quite serious about the quality of the rope. You know, if you rope that will stand up to the strain of anchor cables and, you know, several hundred, if not several thousand ton ships hauling on it, well, you get a slightly thinner version to hold up a medieval tent, and I'm pretty sure the rope's probably the strongest part of the tent these days, certainly compared to the old sisal and twine stuff that it came with, which rotted away and started snapping, which is why I needed to replace it. It's also one of the few places where you can seriously go in and say, hello, I would like a quarter of a kilometre of rope, and they won't blink. They'll just say, oh, that little, really? And over there on the right, you can see one of the roping machines actually on its way forward. The ropery crew, who still operate them, have to walk the thing along because, of course, it's not electrically powered or anything like that. It's being hauled in by a winch at the end of the ropery walk. Of course, that winch may be electric these days, but it would have been steam or water powered in the time period. But the actual action of twisting the various strands into rope is done by a purely mechanical process, as you can see. Also, incidentally, if you want advice on what the best shoes for walking around for a very long time and very long distances are, definitely ask these guys, because that's pretty much their job description. And there you can see a brand new rope taking shape, right before our eyes. And yes, this drone is actually moving at a reasonable clip. I was the mixture of brisk walking and jogging to catch up with it, and we're still going. It's quite impressive just how long a structure they were able to make back in the day. And it's not exactly warped either. You look down it, you can see a straight run down, which is vitally important for rope making. And if you're walking down the outside of the Ropery, which is through the windows to our left, you might get an odd sense of déjà vu, because this whole area has pretty much been kept in its 17th, 18th century condition, and so it's also used quite a lot in period drama film work. It can also serve as a 19th century set, because, well, not a tremendous amount changed externally, so don't be too worried if you actually seem to recognise some parts of the dockyard. But we're now coming to the end, believe it or not, of that incredibly long walk, and behind and to the right, the rope making machine is still making its gradual trundling way the quarter of a mile up to the other end where we started. So, with a little bit of adjustment, let's slide sideways over onto the active part of the rope walk. You can see there one of the other machines that helps make the ropes waiting there, and here's the rope strand, which, as you can see, is still rotating as they're making it further up. And now we'll head into the final part of the rope walk, although, as I say, there is an entire display dedicated to telling you all about ship's ropes, how they're made, etc. So this is not even 20% of what you can see just in this part of the dockyard alone. I just happen to really like it because it combines old age of sail stuff with engineering technology, and you can see all the spools here, just how many individual threads are going into that rope as they go on. And yeah, there's a lot of banks of spools behind ready to take the place of these ones when they are used up. So let's take a quick look at one other aspect of the dockyard, which I have again mentioned earlier, the railway. So this is down at the southern end of the dockyard, and we're going to progress northwards through the bulk of the remaining area, i.e. the historic dockyard area. There's a helicopter there on the left with some lunch tables, but if you've ever wondered what a naval dockyard railway looks like, well, you can see what this one looks like here and now. Progressing up past some of the sheds which have other interesting mysteries and wonders. The main museum area is obviously up there to the right. And there's the bow of Cavalier, a few dockyard cranes, again, very interesting, especially for the engineering-minded of you, because they're quite impressive bits of kit in their own right. And then, of course, me being a slightly inexperienced drone pilot at the time, almost took out or possibly got the drone taken out by that little hanging lamp. So going around that, we can move on past the good old Ocelot there and coming up to Ganette and the covered slipways, which we've seen the interiors of a little bit earlier. So this is the route that the railway and its various rolling stock will run if they happen to be operating on the day of your visit. And as we approach the covered slipways, looking around, there we have the courtyard. Nice place to gather, nice place to have lunch as well. Little lifeboat there. There's a good collection of lifeboats actually in the second covered slipway. And you've heard me mention that I don't like museums that take away all the models of ships. They have a lot of models of ships, all of which are, of course, stored undercover in the museum section of the dockyard. So, once again, many thanks to Chatham Historic Dockyard and, of course, Laurie's Mechanical Marvels for getting me in contact with them to bring you all the footage and pictures you've seen in the latter part of this video. And, of course, the several other videos that will be coming when we take a lot more detailed look at the interior of Cavalier, the C-class destroyers, Ganette and her class of composite sloops, and so on and so forth. And if you're really, really nice, I might even give you a taster of Ocelot. I'm, of course, very happy to report that Historic Dockyard Chatham is now open and will be open until the 20th of November this year, when they close for the winter season, when they do a lot of refit and repair work. So definitely get down there. And as I mentioned with Portsmouth as well, if you happen to be heading down to Chatham and you want to drop me a line on Discord or via email, and the stars align and times are right, I might even be able to pop down and give you a little bit of a guided tour and a chat about some of the more detailed elements of the dockyard, its history, and the various ships that, of course, we can't cover in just this one video. So, thank you very much for listening, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.